Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome back. We're with Deepa Purushothaman today, and so excited to introduce Deepa to our audience. She is a former senior executive and corporate inclusion visionary. Her work is to challenge and redefine the status quo of leadership, success, and power by centering the needs and experiences of women of color. And she was actually a senior partner at Deloitte, where she spent 20 years helping clients grow and transform. And she also focused on women's leadership and inclusion strategies as the managing partner of WIN, Deloitte's pioneering, globally renowned women's initiative, and the first Indian American woman and one of the youngest people to make partner in the firm's history. So cool. She, after leaving Deloitte in 2020, she co-founded Information, a membership-based community for women of color, offering brave, safe, in a new space, placing them in C-suite positions and on boards. And she's also a woman in public policy, program leader in practice at Harvard Kennedy School, and a founding member of ASVARA, India's first leadership academy exclusively for young women. She also wrote a book, The First, the Few, the Only: How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America. So excited to have you with us, Deepa.
Thank you for having me. That is a mouthful, but thank you for having me.
Well, all that experience, it's hard to sum it up. Tell us more. I mean, it sounds really cool what you got to work on at Deloitte and now doing your own thing and founding these amazing organizations. Tell us about your passion for diversity work and where it all got started.
Yeah, I think it started quite a long time ago, even before there was as much focus, obviously, as there is now. I was at Deloitte, as you said, for 20 years. Because I was a first, I think there were a lot of stages that I took and a lot of, people who came to me, right, for mentoring or advice. And so in some ways, I think that the role started informally. I ended up quite early in a large ERG role, right, or a business resource group role where I was leading our Asian initiative for a number of years. And then over time, that really, continued to transition, continued to grow. And then I ended up, as you read, in the women's initiative role for the firm, which is a pretty large role, in a firm of 100,000 people. And it really allowed me to not only focus on some of Deloitte's strategies and opportunities, but also to advise clients and to meet with a lot of external agencies who are trying to start and advance women, and have their own conversations. Because I think what I've learned is that people are on such different stages of this journey. And so you can't assume everyone has a program and knows what to do. And so it started early for me.
That's cool. Yeah. And I think sometimes we just have this natural, part of our story or just this natural inclination or interest that brings us into the work. And it's cool when you work for a massive organization like you did, where they have tools, they have resources, they have support. I'm curious, Deepa, just focusing on your corporate work, and then we'll talk more about what you're up to nowadays. But at the time, for WIN and in these, massive global corporations, what were you hearing as like top trends, issues, problems? And I'm curious where you think things are now, if any better.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of where I sit now in the last couple of years is dealing with a lot of, talking with a lot of large organizations. So I wouldn't say my answer is Deloitte focused. It's more, from talking to companies outside of that role. I would say that everyone's, I think in some ways overwhelmed, to be honest with you. I think some companies don't know where to start, or how to really make change. I think some companies think they're making change. And I'll tell that story in a minute. And then I think others are feeling like they're far down the journey. But unfortunately, I think when you talk to employees, there's sometimes a disconnect between what employers think they're doing and the real impact or the real perceived impact it has on the ground. And I recently did a few talks around a conversation on trust. And I think what we're seeing, and there was research Edelman did last month that suggested that trust from employees, with their employers is at an all-time low, especially in the DE&I space. So unfortunately, I think there's work to do. I feel like more people are talking about it, right? It's a board level issue now, but I think, unfortunately, we're still in the early stages of it. And it's going to take a long time for us to get to where we need to be.
Yeah. And I know a lot of your work is centering the experiences of women of color. And I'm curious about that. Why focus there? Like why if we focus on women of color and those intersectional experiences, will we maybe get progress more quickly?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One is why I personally focus on it, because I could have written a book and done research on women in general. That was really more of my background as I was coming up in corporate. Was I found that there were so few resources and so few stories shared about the experience of women of color. When I wrote the book, I actually interviewed 500 women of color and writing the book, and their stories were so unique. That sort of traversing space where you have this multi-layered identity is very different. And the role models that we have, they're so few and far between. And that's where the title comes from, the first, the few, the only. So many of these women are trailblazers or groundbreakers. And yet we don't talk about the challenges they've had to go through to get there, right? To be the first at the table. And so that's really why I focus there. I often, talk about, on stages and in the book, I think if we can solve for women of color, which tends to be in the research and in the conversations, one of the most marginalized groups in these spaces, right? The least seen, the least heard. I think if we can solve and make work for them, I think it's an opportunity to make work for all. And so that's really what the work is about. It's not really just solving only for women of color, but I think for so long our voices have gone unheard that if we can put more voice and attention on women of color, we can raise the bar and solve the issues that I think a lot of us are having. So many, white women, for example, will come up to me after reading the book and say, like, a lot of it resonates with me. The stories are different, but so many of the themes resonate. So I do think it's about making work for more people in general.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the podcast interviews we've had with like Minda Harts we talked
Yes.
to, and my friend Angel Henry also did a lot of research with women of color. And so I remember her story very similar to yours. Is like, I just thought this was stuff that like happened to me, right?
Yep.
And you interview 500 people, and you're like, oh, this is a
Yes.
universal, shared, all too common negative experience. No
Absolutely.
wonder we're
Yeah.
not seeing women of color advance. And it kind of reminds me of that analogy, the rising tide lifts all boats. I
Yes.
mean, not to play on that, but there is some truth to this. If you focus on the most marginalized, and certainly there's so many other intersections, but race and gender are huge lived experiences, and you fold those together and you make work for women of color, then certainly it should work for more folks, right? It's kind of like when
Yes.
I think about the curb effect with the disabilities community. You cutting curbs, you make it better for folks with bikes and people
Yes.
like me with strollers, and just all people. Like, same thing for women of color. Like, make it work for
Absolutely.
them, and then we're going to meet so many more people where they're at. And you're going to see so many commonalities, but nuances in the stories, much like women or folks of color, folks from other marginalized communities. Love
I think
that,
that's so
Deepa.
true. Yeah, no, I think that's so true. I also think the other fact, just to be super clear, is by 2050, women of color will be the majority of the workforce entering corporate spaces. And so I also think not only do we need to solve for them because they've been the least represented or the most challenged in some ways, but you're also it's a pipeline and a piece of the pie that is growing at such a pace that we need to solve for it just practically as well. So I think that's also makes the group really an interesting group to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. And until recently, I mean, I have to think Minda's book was the first one I picked
Yeah.
up that was about specifically women of color. I'm sure there's several more, and I've read, other work, but certainly now, I mean, there was a week earlier this year, when the top sellers on the top selling book list, there were several women of color as authors about this
Yes.
topic. And I thought, wow, that is positive change. That is exciting to see. And to your point about representation, like, demographics and trends are what they are. I think for leaders to keep putting their head in the sand and hiding and pretending like this isn't going to happen, or I can't find these women, it's just so behind. Like, you're going to be so behind. Start the work now so that you can have an inclusive space for folks. And, I think thinking about the work you do now, Deepa, I wonder, tell us more about the lived experiences unique to women of color. What are some of the non-inclusive experiences or things for our listeners to watch out for?
Yeah, I'll tell one story, in the interest of time, that I tell often because it's for me one of the most profound stories, and it's a story about a Black woman. But in all candor, I have similar stories of Muslim women, or I have similar stories of first generation women, who were the first in their families. But it was a woman in the Midwest. She worked for a large consumer products company. And, 45 minutes into the interview, she really started getting emotional, and we had a completely different conversation than where we started. And it was because she said to me, Deepa, I knew I was the first Black woman in my department. I knew that. I'm now 6 months. I think it was around 6, 8 months that when we met, she was that far into her tenure. She said, I now know I'm the only Black woman in the entire company. And then she started, sobbing and saying, I moved my family here. My husband relocated with us, all of this. And she said, we come to realize we're one of the only Black families in the entire town because of where it's geographically located. And she said, until you started asking me these questions, I don't think I understood the weight of that. And she said, I feel very responsible. And we were on Zoom, so she did air quotes, but for making sure everyone around me, all my white colleagues, have a good experience with me, and that they see all Black people in a positive light. And she said, I changed, and much longer conversation that I'm truncating, but I've changed how I wear my hair and how I talk, what I talk about, what I bring for lunch. And she just kept going through this list that was, as we were talking, was becoming longer and longer. And she said, I feel so responsible for representing my race in a good way. And the core to the story is she's not, in comms or in HR or some role where maybe I can make a stretched reason why that was particularly important. She was an accountant, and yet felt so responsible and so weighed down by making sure, she was taking on this other responsibility. And so many of the women of color I interviewed had all these extra things. I call them the job outside of the job, right? Or the job within the job. All these extra things that they're carrying that we don't have space to talk about. And they're heavy and they're hard and they take an emotional toll. So that's just one story, one example. And so part of my work with her was helping her understand, yes, maybe you want to do that, but let's be more conscious about what parts of that you take on and what parts of that you give back, because you don't get paid for that. You don't have to do that. And you need to decide if you want to do that and what parts of that, you enjoy doing. So, really, really, I think a great example of what the book is about and what the stories are about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that pressure to have to represent everyone else that looks like you, everyone else that could want to be successful in the future. I mean, that is a tremendous amount of pressure that certainly folks in the majority group, I can't imagine would have that same thought of like, if I ruin this, I'm going to do it for all the white men. It's just
Yeah,
probably
it's
not something
totally different. And it's my own journey. I mean, part of my story is I started to get, part of why I left was I was having this combination of asking bigger questions around purpose. But then I started to get really sick. And towards the last couple of years, I mean, I did a lot of travel, it was an intense job. It had started to really take its toll. And I started gathering women of color in an attempt to figure out what else should I do at a senior level? What does one do after 20 years in one place? And I ended up doing about a dozen dinners across the country. And those dinners, I met 300 women of color. Again, we're really casual. We're really networking oriented. And yet what ended up happening is these profound patterns in what the women were saying. They were finishing each other's sentences. They were telling stories about the challenges and, yes, the opportunities, but a lot of the challenges, and they had never talked about them before. And one of the women in the group said, and it came up over and over again as I interviewed women officially, but she said, I sit in a seat of power and I don't feel powerful. I gave up everything to get to this, and she was in a C-suite position. And I don't know if it was worth it. And that's what I really wanted to unpack and understand. So all of a sudden the conversations pivoted from what am I going to do next to like, why is that? And how do I understand that more? Because we need to fix that. That's not how women of color and women should be feeling when they take these seats.
No, that tremendous weight and that tremendous pressure. And then you think like, what am I doing to make it better so that other women don't have to deal with this?
Yeah,
I can
absolutely.
imagine that would just be so taxing. And I think that's the burden that women of color have a lot of times, especially in diversity work. They get over, we know studies show they're overrepresented in this one space inside organizations, in the diversity space. And they're being asked a lot of times to volunteer their time to do additional efforts to help with systemic issues that they didn't create that adversely affect them. But it doesn't mean just because you've had that experience, you know how to fix that problem. And that's where I think allies can come in. I wonder, Deepa, what can we do to create more cultures around allyship and supporting women of color?
Yeah, no, I think the first thing is really understanding, and I kind of alluded to it before. I get called to a lot of executive tables, and it's usually a white male executive who will say to me, I ask my employees how they feel, and they tell me. I'll go meet with those same Black and brown employees an hour later and hear a completely different set of stories. And so I think one, it's really understanding that, and we're still early in this journey, and there isn't really a lot of benefit for, in a lot of places, for telling our truth. I call women of color truth tellers, quite a lot in the book. And the challenge is telling our truth sometimes comes at a cost. So I think the first is really stepping back and making sure we're listening in the right ways and creating safe space, is why I call it safe space. But really, really thinking about how do you actually have and empower people to have honest conversations without blowback. I think secondly, it's looking at your processes and your procedures and making sure they don't actually hurt women of color. So many women of color, and there's a whole chapter on this in the book, once they report discrimination or racism or talk about something that is inappropriate, there's actually a backlash, and the processes don't actually support women of color in telling their truth. So it's actually looking at your internal processes. And then I think thirdly, it's what can you do in the moment? I think so often we think of these things as company or culture issues, but so much of allyship is what do you do in the moment when you see something that doesn't feel right in your gut? And part of the most, profound thing that I've learned in doing this research is that so few of us, whether it's white men and women, whether it's women of color, even Black women, haven't really had deep, deep conversations about race when they were growing up. They've had some conversations, but race at work is still a really new and evolving conversation. So most of us have not been taught what to do in those moments when something happens that's inappropriate or racist. And so I would say to our allies who are listening, like, don't put it on women of color if you hear something that's inappropriate or doesn't feel right. Please stand up in that moment. Please practice what you're going to say and do something so that it's not all on us to fix culture and speak up. Like, there are things that even if you're not in a position where you think you can influence policy or procedures or even behavior, just own your actions in a moment that's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I hear so often, especially from women of color, that the people saw that what happened was inappropriate, right? They knew in the pit of their stomach that they didn't feel right. But instead of saying something, you're bystanders
Yeah.
and you're participating in the problem when you do that. Even if you think, well, I didn't say the thing, I didn't do the thing, I would never do that. But if you don't say it's okay, it's the same as saying it's okay. And that behavior will continue. So appreciate those insights. And I think the whole idea of individual actions versus systemic issues. I mean, systemic issues can be daunting. They take time and patience. And that's why, again, we need more allies. We need more leadership support to do that. But everybody from an individual perspective can at least bring up a systemic issue and try to work to resolve it or find the right resourcing to support it. So appreciate that dichotomy because such an important part of the diversity conversation right now, Deepa. Thinking about the future, and I know a few years into this, with all the research you've done, the book you've written, the speaking you've done, if you could like put together like a future vision for where women of color are, knowing, the fastest growing part of our labor force, it's a really compelling business case for this, but thinking about the future for women of color, what do you wish organizations were doing more of?
I wish they were actually making more space for women of color to show up in full voice. And what that means is, I think, there is focus on hiring and advancing women, not as much as I'd like to see, but, I think there's some effort that is trying to interject and do some things to improve that process. But what I'm finding for a lot of the women of color I work with is once they even get to that seat still, there's still a pressure to conform. One of the biggest findings in my conversations is that pressure to conform, this idea that leadership looks exactly like how it's looked for the last 20, 30, 50 years. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like us. It doesn't feel like us. And so there's a lot of pressure to behave in certain ways. And so I think even when women of color get to the seat, they're not feeling whole, they're not feeling happy, they're not feeling powerful. And most importantly, for companies, they're not in full voice and able to create culture change. So I think it behooves companies to make more space for women of color to show up in full voice. But I also think it helps women of color to really stay in these roles that they're hired into if we could actually, support them in that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's part of the mystery, making behind the scenes with DEI is how do you create that space? Like really open up the space for people to feel like they can be their authentic, genuine selves in the workplace. And of course, we're seeing like record high levels of burnout, of resignation still, of people just deciding like, I'm not going to deal with this anymore. I'm not going to stay at an organization where I have to cover so many parts of me to fit into this impossible mold. And that's the part that it's just tricky, I think, for folks that want to be allies that haven't had that lived experience, that haven't walked around as a woman or a person of color or somebody that's marginalized. A lot of times I think that empathy valve is what's missing. Like you just, because it hasn't happened to you, or maybe someone you care about it's happened to, but you didn't even know until, like you said, have these dinners, have this, open forum for communication. Then it's like the floodgates of just that shared experience that could be so much better. I wonder, how do organizations, you mentioned the listening sessions you've done. I see you. Here's one thing, you hear a different thing. I've done some of that too. It's
Yes.
so interesting what people say when it's truly anonymous.
Yep.
They share very candid experiences and, really sad ones. I mean, those really pull at my heartstrings so much in all the work that we do. But I wonder, Deepa, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you, if you're thinking, oh, this isn't a problem here, or like, oh, we're doing so much better, how do organizations really discover that this is a universal problem? This is happening here.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? The only way I can answer that is to share kind of my own experiences. This book is launched. It came into the world March 1st, and I've probably spoken at 200 companies in the first like 90 days. I mean, it was again because a lot of it was
Wow.
virtual. I could do that, but I think what's interesting in a lot of my message is that corporate spaces aren't a meritocracy. We need to stop, talking about them as if they are. I thought that would be a very controversial message. I thought that a lot of companies would back away from that. And some of them, are uncomfortable with that, but most of them are not. Most of them are willing to have that discussion and to really talk about how the experiences are different. The extra work is different. The dialogue is different. The code switching, the fact that a lot of women of color feel like they have to show up in a certain way. It's not necessarily who they are, in other spaces. I think those are all real conversations. And I think the data is what is helpful. I think the 500 stories makes a lot of executives. And again, I was surprised. It was a lot of white male executives who initially read the book and reached out. Say to me, because you have the volume of stories, because you're cross industry, because you have so many, we can't say that only happens in banking or that only happens in tech, where I think there's more acceptance. Of course, that happens. I think there's more growing acceptance that's happening everywhere. And so I think a little bit of it is finding other ways to get educated and hear the stories, and then opening up space and just listening in a very different way. And I think the stories, more women of color willing to share them than ever before. I think that's, you're alluding to the 5 or 6 authors that came out with books at the same time. I think there's momentum right now, and so more of us are talking about the systemic issues, which is a very new conversation. Until 2
Mm-hmm.
years ago, right? It was a lot of you as an individual woman of color should try harder, do more, lean in, right? That sort of discussion. And now there's an opening of like, but the system is also broken. Yes, like there's things you can do to, prepare to be a leader, but let's also talk about the systemic issues. And so I think I see a shift happening. I see an openness in a way that I had not seen before that I'm optimistic about. Now, what they do after the conversation, I think, is the more important part.
Right.
But at least they're willing to, put their toe in a space. And I mean traditional banks and traditional pharmaceutical companies, places I would not have expected. So it's for me, it's been
Exciting.
actually surprising in a good sort of way.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth underscoring that we have seen a more openness to have the conversation and to
Yeah.
listen to the stories with George Floyd and so many, things that continue to happen today. People's eyes are more open and they're
Yes.
more willing to listen to this. And I think what you said is really important for leaders that are listening, that are inside an organization or helping organizations like Deep and I do, like figuring out a way to open that space, right? How do you create space so that the stories in your book people realize are happening here, they're happening everywhere, and can't pretend like it's not our problem. That apathetic response is always so bothersome to me, as like, oh,
Yep.
not our industry, or excuses, blame game, all that stuff. It's like, but this is a common issue, accept that it is happening here and understand how it's happening here, because that part might be a bit nuanced based on your, company's culture. But then dig in. What are the things that are happening? What are the things that need to start, stop, continue, and be really diligent with that action plan for the future? And that's where I think we start to see positive change, is not just about the story sharing and opening the space, but there's an accountability to being better and behaving better in the future. I wonder, Deepa, what are some ideas you might share about systemic changes that have to be addressed so that we create a more inclusive workplace for women of color?
Yeah, I mentioned before, so I'll just pick on that one and talk about it a little bit more. I think processes, a lot of companies are saying, for example, they want, people to come forward if something inappropriate happens or a racist incident happens. Yet the data doesn't suggest that, those outcomes are actually favorable to the person reporting. So I think if we do nothing else, really looking at HR processes, really looking at processes for reporting, looking at like help hotlines a lot of companies have, right? Like a hotline you can call and lodge a complaint. What happens with that data? What happens with those calls? Who's sitting in the seat and actually evaluating if there's a problem? The companies that are doing this well right now have, most of them have hired outside investigators, have really outsourced the problem of when something is reported, the investigation of it. And most of those companies are using their data in a very different sort of way, looking at patterns of attrition, looking at, who's leaving, when are they leaving, are there any things that we need to really signal that are not coming up in exit interviews. So I would say that's really where I think I would start, because I think we have the data now to do better in those places. And I think we have companies who have really, been birthed in the last 2 years that are really doing a very different job of really trying to understand what needs to change from a HR and a reporting process so that employees feel safe when they come forward and we can actually make culture change that needs to happen.
I love that. Yeah, an investigative phase, not in a
Yeah.
scary way, but like do some
Yeah.
fact finding, do some digging. There's so many parallels to how we run business. I mean, as the experienced consultants, like, okay, step one, figure out what the problem is,
Yes,
right?
exactly. And
So,
who's sitting in the seat, right? I mean,
mhm,
not to say everyone is a challenge, but what we found in the data and the research is that a lot of who's sitting in the seat investigating are white HR leaders, and unfortunately, they're maybe not as well versed on race as I think most of them would say. And so
true.
these incidents are sometimes hard to understand or hard to relate to. And so having an outside agency who has more experience, who, like my dinners, has the patterns across companies, you can put more nuance to it, right? Like more data around it, more storytelling to it, and really really pinpoint what is a challenge. Whereas I think sometimes, to your point, I mean, that's why you're asking the questions. I think sometimes we think that doesn't happen here or that's a one-time incident. But I think there's new ways to really uncover when something is a one-time incident versus like, is it more of a systemic issue?
Yeah, yeah, the frequency, where it's happening, what
Yeah.
pockets. And I think you acknowledged a really good point, as a white practitioner of this work, being really clear about the limitations that I have, right? I have not walked around in black or brown skin for my life, and that's, not something that's probably possible. And so, what does that look like? And really being curious to understand versus impart our own judgments and perspectives based on what's happened to us. Like, thinking more people were just willing to park. Like, this is the world has not treated everyone the same.
Yep.
And everyone's not like me. Therefore, they've had different lived experiences, and listening to those experiences, finding commonality in them, and then mapping to solutions. So good, Deepa. I love all of this. Tell our listeners if there was one pearl you've discovered from all of your speaking engagements and research with the book. Is there one thing you'd like to leave our listeners with that they could, really, really think on, take action on?
I think the one pearl that comes up over and over and again is practice, and we don't talk about it enough, right? So what I found with the women of color I interviewed is so often when something was said that was racist, they would feel pain and shame in the moment and not know if they should speak up, right? Like, did anyone else hear that? Am I going to be seen as difficult if I say something about it? And what I teach women of color to do is literally to write out 3 things they can say, because you kind of know the things that are going to come up. So for me, for example, it used to be my name or my age. I looked younger than I was, right? Like I know that that's going to come up in the next couple of weeks, right? Someone's going to say something, whether it's aggressive or just, mild mannered. And so practicing what I'm going to say in that situation, writing it out, and then literally practicing it out loud. And what I'm advising allies, this is not in the book, but this is from the speaking, is that same sort of situation I mentioned before, like where we don't talk about race enough, especially racism at work. So practicing knowing that you are probably going to witness something that is inappropriate when something is said. So literally thinking, can I say going forward, what was just said really bothers me. I need us to pause. Is anyone else bothered by what was just said? Because it didn't sit well with me. Or, after the meeting, we're going to need to talk about this. Like whatever that is for you, but literally practice saying that in the mirror like 10 times out loud, because you will be surprised how much race topics like just elicit shame and pain. And so we're just all paralyzed on both sides. And so really just practicing so that we take the emotion out of it and we start to solve, issues in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that. Hey, we're going to take that offline. We're going to talk about that after this, or, hey, what do you mean when you said that? Or, depending on the severity, like, that's not cool. Please don't say that again. Yes. I mean, just having some, and that's funny, Deepa, it's not funny, but in my work, I find that that's oftentimes the number one thing people struggle with. They don't know what to say or do.
Exactly.
They know that what someone said was wrong. Like we all have a beacon of fairness and our alarm bells go off when it doesn't feel fair. At the same time, the shame and blame and the negative emotion triggering that happens prevents us from being successful in those very moments that people need us the most. So speak up.
And you don't have to call people out. Like it doesn't have to be, like what you just said makes you a bad person. It can just be like, I'm not sure what, how that just landed for me. Right. That's
exactly.
An offensive sort of, or going to put someone on their heels. It's just kind of raising, like, I can't let that go because now I'm on my heels.
Yeah. Yeah. I find playing around with different language, different scripts that people can use. Like, I used to think that too, or here's why that's a problem, or here's my perception of that, rather than that shamey, blaming language, which is most likely going to lead to defensiveness and hopefully not retaliation, but sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Human behavior. So interesting. And so many opportunities that you've laid out for us to be better today, Deepa. So thankful for your work. And tell our listeners, how can they get your book? How can they stay in touch with you?
Absolutely. So everything about what I do is on my website. So Deepa Puru, DeepaPuru.com. The book is everywhere. So I won't tell you where to go, but wherever you buy books, it will be there. And it's out now, and it's also on Audible. So, there are different ways to get access to it. If you want to listen and you're not a visual reader. So yes.
Yeah. Please. That's great. Yeah. And a lot of podcast listeners are Audible subscribers. So, and that's not an easy feat to create your Audible version for your book. Having done that myself, I commend you because it's a lot of work to do that.
Yes, it is.
Fun stuff. Well, awesome, Deepa. Thanks so much for being on the show today. So thankful for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all you do as well.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program, or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.